What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are here with the return of Moon Knight in Marvel Comics, his resurrection, really, if we want to call it that. So this takes place in a story called The Vengeance of Moon Knight. It's about 9 issues long, but we're going to cover pretty much all of it, and it's actually a lot easier to follow than you might think. So this initially comes hot off the heels of Moon Knight's death. And a lot of the things that took place over the course of Jed MacKay's initial run, we'll cover over the course of this story to kind of give things context as it's needed. But as far as the idea of Moon Knight's death is concerned, it was actually kind of a side plot to what was happening at the time. The main villain of Moon Knight in the here and now is a guy called Zodiac. He is still alive, he will ultimately come back. It's only a matter of when that happens in Marvel. As kind of a side plot, there was a villain called the Black Spectre, and the idea was to basically drive the city of New York into madness. In order to keep that from happening, Mark Spector sacrificed his life. And so in the aftermath of his official death, you kind of have a coming together of various people who knew him and respected him, or at the very least associated with him, even if they didn't really like him all too much, along with the Midnight Mission. Now that brings in the next bit of context. One of the things that Jed MacKay had established in his initial run was that Moon Knight, operating as an agent of Khonshu, the Fist of Khonshu, is effectively a protector of those who travel through the night. And while his stories over the years had sidetracked to him like working in Vegas and all kinds of different stuff, Jed MacKay kind of brought him back to basics. The formation of the Midnight Mission was this really cool idea where those individuals who had felt that they had been aggrieved in some way, or they were in fear for their life, or there was some kind of credible danger, right, in basically Mark Spector's territory, his little section of New York, they could come to him and they could air their grievances, right? They could tell him their concerns. And if he had the power to do so, he would operate on their behalf and basically eliminate whatever that concern happened to be. So it was as much a kind of like old school heroes for hire / charity, taking care of the people in his neighborhood type thing. It was a great concept. But at this point in time, because Mark Spector's dead, initially the Midnight Mission takes it upon themselves to go out into the world and to try to carry on his ideologies. Now, the Midnight Mission consists of Reese, who's a 19-year-old girl that was turned into a vampire, Soldier, who was a guy that was actually shot by a bullet that went through Reese, which basically infected him with her vampiric blood. He became a vampire. Tigra was basically the girl that Mark Spector was banging, and the two of them were actually in love. And Badir was actually an expansion to the Moon Knight mythos that we'll talk about here in a little while, because we're going to kind of circle back around to the idea of the fact that Moon Knight cannot technically die. The initial idea of what goes on with the Midnight Mission doing their thing is they actually come across a couple demons. These guys are dealt with pretty swiftly, right? It's nothing too crazy and not really too spectacular. It's just kind of, some threats out there that they deal with. Where things really become interesting is for the character of Tigra, which she kind of strikes out on her own, trying to find the Black Spectre. Now, of course, at this point, nobody knows where he is, and they don't know that at the ending of the last story, that Zodiac had shown up to the Black Spectre over anger about the fact that Black Spectre had kind of screwed up Zodiac's plans and seemingly killed him, right? So again, they don't really have the full story and the full context of what's going on. What also goes on here is one of the members of the mission named 8-Ball literally just gets absolutely thrashed. This guy gets crushed and thrown through the entrance of the Midnight Mission, only for Moon Knight, who's all clad in black as opposed to his traditional white, to show up here and say, "Get out of my house." Now, here's the kicker about this, right? And this is where things get really, really cool. Because I'll tell you right now, this story is phenomenal. So what happens is that initially, they don't necessarily know if it's actually him or not. The reason for this is because one of the things that Jed MacKay established was that when Moon Knight dies, he always comes back, but there's a limit to the number of times that he can return. What always happens with the Fists of Khonshu is that they basically become his agents by whatever manner and whatever means. They go out into the world and they do Khonshu's bidding. When they die, they're brought back. But after a certain number of times, they're no longer brought back, and instead, they become a member of his kind of stable, right? These individuals that reside basically in the dimension of Khonshu, and then a new Moon Knight is chosen on Earth to take their place. And so when Mark Spector died at the end of the last run from Jed MacKay, he was not supposed to return. It was supposed to be a permanent death. And so that's why, with everybody in the Midnight Mission kind of knowing this, it's like, okay, but like he's not supposed to be back. So like, is he back? Like, what's what's going on here, right? Nobody really knows for sure in terms of what's happening. All they know is that he's doing things like throwing pepper in the face of Tigra, right? And where Mark Spectre and Tigra were in love, Moon Knight is very dismissive of her. More so than that, he's like, that's my house. Get out of the Midnight Mission. So they decide to put it to a test. Now, it's not one of these things where it's like, we're going to test you and we're going to see what you do. Instead, there's a couple small clues that come out as to who this guy is, as well as the fact that it's not actually Mark Spectre. Mark will return, but in the moment, it's essentially an imposter. The first way in which this clue is given to us is the fact that this guy emits dark force energy. And for those of you guys who are not familiar with dark force energy, it's not really an energy source that blocks out light. Instead, it actually negates light. So light cannot penetrate through dark force energy of any kind. And when that happens, this guy starts thrashing Tigra. And the fact that she's beat with such relentlessness shows that it's not Mark. Because even if Mark were experiencing some measure of insanity, there's still the other personalities, Jake Lockley, Steve Grant, and we've seen on multiple occasions, those personalities will step up and stop Mark Spectre from acting and take his place as far as his actions and so on, and kind of bring things back to rights. And so Reese says, okay, fine, do you want the mansion? You can have the mansion. Take the mansion. And remember, for those of you guys who read Jed McKay's previous run, the mansion is sentient. So those individuals who try to break into it, which people have done before, the mansion will quite literally chew them up, spit them out, or lock them away in some other dimension, never to be seen or heard from again. And so when Moon Knight goes into the house rejects him. And that's how they immediately know that it's not Mark Spectre, right? They're like, okay, something's going on here. You are not Moon Knight. And so ultimately this guy just teleports away and is like, if I see you, if you come after me, I will kill you all. Well, of course, at that point, it's a matter of figuring out who this guy is, right? They can't just let that go. More so than that, word starts getting around. When Mark Spectre as Moon Knight was running the Midnight Mission, in a lot of ways, it was this is my section of New York. You stay away, I stay away. So a lot of villains out there gave him a wide berth because as we saw in the Jed McKay run, when one of the guys trying to kill Moon Knight contracted Taskmaster, Taskmaster's like, you don't understand what you're asking, right? To go after Mark Spectre, that guy's crazy. That guy, if he finds out that I've been contracted to come after you, he's gonna just probably give me a pass, right? Because, he respects me enough and I respect him enough that I'm not even gonna do the hit in the first place. But if he knows you're the one who put the hit out, he's gonna kill you and then he's gonna kill anybody you ever met. He'll kill your third grade teacher for no other reason than inconveniencing him. You do not want Mark Spectre coming after you. So there's a lot of fear that people have about how crazy Moon Knight is in Marvel. It was dope the way that it was handled. It was really, really cool. But word has gotten around that this fake Moon Knight is basically wreaking havoc across the city, absolutely pummeling villains, going after them, almost kind of acting the way they believe Mark Spectre would act, but not really acting the way he would actually act. So it's really following more of a idealized version of Moon Knight than anything else. And so what ends up happening here is the Midnight Mission, faced with no other real opportunity or other options, ends up going to meet with Lady Yu'lon. Now, Lady Yu'lon was actually introduced in Jed McKay's run, if I remember correctly, and it was one of those things where Moon Knight had a sit down with her because while Lady Yu'lon is a vampire running her own little section of New York, there was another vampire clan that was trying to overtake her territory. So she hit up Moon Knight helped her out, and that's why the Midnight Mission is coming and saying, you owe Moon Knight a favor, and by extension, you owe us as the Midnight Mission a favor because we're carrying on the legacy of Moon Knight. He scratched your back, you scratch ours. Tell us where the fake Moon Knight stays. Because Lady Yu'lon knows everything, right? Everything that goes on in the city of New York. And so they end up finding out that where the fake Moon Knight resides is where Mark Spectre initially died. And it's a genius place to go to because it's the one place they would never go, if for no other reason than the fact that the whole experience of knowing their friend died there would just be too traumatic. But at the end of the day, they also see it as an extreme affront. Now, I will say that Badir and Tigra are the only ones who really show up here. Now, there are a couple reasons for this. The most notable reason is the fact that they're going in the daytime because Moon Knight effectively operates at night, so during the day he would be sleeping. And so that means that Reese and Soldier can't come along because vampires can't walk around in the sun. But the other reason for this is that with this fake Moon Knight sleeping during the day, it could be a sneak attack, right? I mean, is it kind of shady and underhanded? Sure, but like, you do what you got to do against an opponent like this. And so while they get into the building and there's all this circuitry and these gadgets that are designed to, you know, basically set off proximity alarms and stuff like that, Tigra and Badir don't really know how to handle that kind of stuff. That would be something better suited for Soldier. But because of the fact that Tigra wants to deal with this in the here and now, and a surprise attack is their best chance at being able to take this guy out, they just go in, guns blazing, tripping all these motion sensors all along the way. All these alarms start going off and like the fake Moon Knight is woken up, right? And it's like, okay, like once they finally meet each other, then it's like history repeats itself. We are here yet again. And it's like, I suppose it does. Here I am telling you to get out of my house again. And the fight breaks out. But here's the irony behind it. Badir's prepared for this because what he realizes in facing off against this guy in the past, that while he doesn't really seem to know exactly who this person is, he does know where this person comes from. And this individual is a member of a group called the Cult of Kali. Now, the Cult of Kali, as far as the Jed MacKay run of Moon Knight goes, introduced this kind of old feud between the Cult of Kali and the Cult of Khonshu. The reason being because the Cult of Kali was more like an assassin group, whereas the Cult of Khonshu protected those individuals at night. So quite literally, the Kali guys would assassinate people at night, and the Khonshu guys would try to protect people at night. So as you can imagine, they were opposites, right? They literally were the antithesis of each other. And for a time, they went to war against one another. And most all of the members of the Cult of Kali were wiped out. And so while Badir doesn't know this guy's identity because of the fighting style, he deduces what group he belongs to. And that's why he initially believes this guy is Rami, right? The Fist of Khonshu, the last of my order to face the Cult of Kali. And so as the fight continues on, Tigra initially gets the upper hand. And where this guy says, I don't want to kill you, Greer, but I will if I have to, of course, Badir comes back and says, you'll kill nobody, imposter. And ultimately the guy's unmasked. And Tigra is the one who figures out who it is, that it's the Shroud. Now, the Shroud, historically speaking, has been a low-level villain in Marvel Comics. And so the repurposing of his character for the sake of this story is really, really cool. Now, as the fight kind of goes on with these guys, you know, the nature of Shroud is that he, again, uses Dark Force energy, that he was at one point a member of the Cult of Kali, and that he did attain the power to manipulate Dark Force energy. But again, he kind of models himself after Moon Knight, and the way things are going to end with his character is kind of tragic. The reason being because of the fact that as the fight goes through, he starts talking about how he doesn't want to be called the Shroud anymore, that the name only stands for failure, that instead he was friends with Moon Knight and wanted to model himself after Moon Knight by taking up the mantle of Mark. Now here's the thing, to say that he's a friend of Moon Knight is a stretch at best, right? In the old school West Coast Avengers comics from the early 1990s, volume 2 is what it was, that there was a point when he actually asked Moon Knight if he wanted to join his group. And of course, Moon Knight said no, you know, he declined, and he kind of aided him on again, off again. But I don't know that outside of the Midnight Mission that Mark Spector had ever really wanted or really needed a friend. So I don't know that anybody's ever actually the friend of Moon Knight. But at the very least, he was an ally. But have no illusions here, right? When it comes to the Shroud, while historically, again, he is a low-level villain, the kind of reworking here and the way that Jed MacKay uses him is phenomenal, because harnessing Dark Force energy makes him one of the most dangerous villains in the entirety of the Marvel Universe. Because when it comes to harnessing Dark Force, unless you have the ability to counter that level of power, meaning you would have to be able to manipulate energy on vast levels, you can't really overcome this guy unless he allows you to. So that, of course, includes like physically fighting him. Of course, he could be overcome physically, but if he just encases you and seemingly just keeps you there, you would lose your mind. No semblance of time, right? You would literally start to go insane. And ultimately your mind would just shut down and he would just walk away having been victorious. And so this guy gets the upper hand on them like that. And that's an impressive feat, especially against someone like Badir, who is a Fist of Khonshu. Now that brings in the nature of Badir himself, because I'm sure a lot of you guys are kind of curious about his character. When it came to the original Jed MacKay run, what he established here was that Black Spectre was not the only person to ever be the Fist of Khonshu, and very much in the same way of Matt Fraction expanding the Iron Fist mythos and saying Danny Rand is not the Iron Fist, Danny Rand is the current Iron Fist, and guys like Orson Randall were the Iron Fist before him, which was a run that never got concluded. Matt Fraction dropped like this massive cliffhanger and left. It sucked. It was such a great story that never really got a good conclusion. But at the end of the day, because of the fact that Shroud is able to overtake all of them, one of the things that Tigra does is actually kind of call him out. And she says, no, you're full of crap. The reason why is because the Black Spectre you knew was not the Moon Knight that he was when he died. He was hyper violent back then, that he just was effectively a crazy guy operating under the whims of a god. But as time went on, he began to care about more than simply just himself. And that's why she says, you and Mark were the same. You are right, but you were the same. He got help. He got better. He did the work to fix his life. But you are just a coward. Moon Knight fought the Avengers, conquered an insane god. He fell about as low as a man could fall, but he died a hero that I loved. And so that's why she says, you cannot take over this mantle, because even if you were somehow able to get yourself sorted out, it's an affront to everything he stood for to go out and act in the same way that Moon Knight used to act, because it disrespects all the work that he put into to improve himself. And so Shroud, kind of seeing the error of his ways, quote unquote, not to sound cliche or goofy, is just kind of like, you know what? You guys are right. So it's one of these cool things where he's not like some crazed guy, some villain who just wants to destroy the name of Moon Knight. He was actually doing what he thought was the right thing. Here's the kicker. As the group kind of makes up, and ultimately Shroud is seemingly prepared to put away the Moon Knight suit while we have no clue what would happen with Moon Knight if that were to happen, suddenly all the Dark Force energy under his control is lost from his control and is spread across the world. Now, that goes into a story called Blood Hunt, which was trash. So the idea behind Blood Hunt, on paper, it was great. It was phenomenal. In practical application, it was awful. The idea was that Blade was possessed by this just like vampiric entity named Varney, and that ultimately all the Dark Force powers of Dark Force wielders were stolen, and it was encased across the world, basically blocking out the sun. It meant that vampires could walk free, and with Blade having already seized control of the vampire nation from Dracula, Blade intended to lead a vampire uprising across the world, albeit Blade being possessed. Ultimately, it led to Doctor Doom allying with Doctor Strange, borrowing Doctor Strange's powers, casting a spell using his own sorcery, and undoing all of the Dark Force energy. And then Doctor Doom kept the powers and was like, I'm going to fix the world. And that will lead us into a story in January called One World Under Doom. At the moment, Doom is literally running through the world testing various superheroes and whatnot. What is important here when it comes to the resurrection of Moon Knight is that as part of the Blood Hunt event, that one of the things that had happened during Jed MacKay's run is that Moon Knight had traveled to the realm of Khonshu. And while Khonshu was technically in a prison, which we'll talk about as we get further through this, that he was able to enlist the aid of past Fists of Khonshu to basically face off against the villain Zodiac. That's exactly what they intend to do here, right? That when it comes to Tigra and it comes to Badir and these guys, their intention is to travel basically to the realm of Asgard and free Khonshu. The reason for that being is because during the Avengers run by Jason Aaron, Moon Knight had effectively gained the power of the Phoenix and then defeated Khonshu as a way to kind of free himself from Khonshu's control. That's where the Jed MacKay run picks up, and that's where the start of the Midnight Mission storyline begins. And so all this time, Khonshu has just been like sitting in a prison cell in Asgard. And as most of you guys know, with Asgardian magics and technology, if you want to call it that, that sort of thing, you don't just like pick the lock and leave, right? So I mean, like he's stuck there. There's nowhere for him to go, and there's nothing he can do. And so what ends up happening through all of this is that with Badir and Tigra showing up here, they actually brought in the aid of Wrecker. Now, this is a portion of the Blood Hunt story that I believe we covered. I cannot remember off the top of my head. So this may be a kind of repeat for those of you guys who saw the coverage of Blood Hunt when we initially ran over it. But essentially, Wrecker has an Asgardian enchanted crowbar. And using that crowbar, he shows up here and literally busts the locks off this prison, and Khonshu is freed. And so immediately, Khonshu whisks Tigra and Badir and Wrecker away back to his own dimension. And so the question they have is, what comes next? And this is where the resurrection of Moon Knight comes into play, and it's really dope, because what Khonshu does is immediately looking upon Earth, he realizes everything that's happening with Blood Hunt, the vampire uprising and all that kind of stuff. And the chief, I guess, role of Khonshu above everything else, even his manipulations of Mark Spectre, is to protect those who travel through the night. Well, if vampires are attacking everybody who's traveling through the night, then it's a direct affront to Khonshu himself. So what he ends up doing is bringing out every single fist of Khonshu that's ever existed, and he intends to send them out into the world. Now, the initial question is, okay, like, what about Mark? And it's really more Tigra's question than anything else. Like, what about Mark? Like, is he just one of these mindless forces that you have now? And the response of Khonshu is, no, right? Mark Spectre was the greatest of my Moon Knights, and the greatest he remains. Mark Spectre will lead them. So Khonshu resurrects Mark Spectre and then gives him back his normal mind, right? Basically the kind of dissociative identity disorder that he has, but he's officially resurrected from the dead and literally leads the forces of Khonshu on Earth in the middle of the whole Blood Hunt event. Now, that goes directly into Blood Hunt itself, which what's really interesting about this is that when it comes to the Moon Knight tie-ins for Blood Hunt, there really isn't a whole lot doing there. In fact, the initial tie-in, I think there's like maybe 2 or 3 issues. The whole first issue is him coming back and like everybody being excited that he's there. Like Reese and Soldier are like, oh my God, you're here, and you know, all that kind of cool stuff. And that's basically it. But it's just kind of like a side story that doesn't really seem, I mean, it ties in, but doesn't feel like it ties in, if that makes any sense. Instead, what ends up happening at the end of issue number 8, which is actually only 1 tie-in, so I stand corrected on that. What ends up happening at the end of issue number 8, where seemingly nothing happened, is that Mark Spectre sits down in the Midnight Mission and he's contacted by Khonshu. And Khonshu says, you owe me a life, you owe me a favor, I want you to kill the false Moon Knight. Now here's the kicker about this, right? Like initially it just kind of seems like back at the same game again, right? Like Mark Spectre's on Earth, he does the bidding of Khonshu, and every once in a while, Khonshu asks him to do something that even for Moon Knight is morally questionable. This is one of those instances because he says, I have no interest in doing this. I have no interest in facing off against these guys or killing some false Moon Knight or anything along those lines. I don't want to have anything to do with that at all. But at the end of the day, an order from Khonshu is an order from Khonshu. And like so many of us who are millennials heard from our parents, Khonshu would effectively tell Moon Knight, I brought you into this world, I can take you out. And so that's what Mark Spectre's contending with here. That's the concern. Khonshu could just pull him right back into his dimension and he spends the rest of his life as a mindless henchman standing in a giant vaulted room waiting to be called forth, assuming that time ever comes. So he does exactly what he was instructed to do. He tracks down Shroud. Now, what's so sad about this is Shroud is initially like, look, I knew I did the wrong thing. Like, I'm sorry I did what I did. I was trying to live up to your memory and to your mantle. But the whole time, Mark is just like, put the mask on. Put on the mask. Like, you wanted to be Moon Knight? Now it's time to be Moon Knight. You wanted to take over my role? Now it's time to take over the role. Let's see if you can handle it, right? He says, one way or another, a Moon Knight dies tonight. And that's just kind of the statement to Shroud. There is no coming back from this. What he did was an affront to a god, and gods demand sacrifice. And so ultimately, the fight breaks out between the two of them. Now, initially, Shroud holds back, and Moon Knight calls it out. He's like, no. If we're gonna do this, we're gonna do this right. You're not gonna hold back. You're not gonna be super apologetic. You're gonna be the guy you were when you single-handedly took out Badir, who is my equal, and Tigra at the same time. Give me your best, because if I'm going to kill you, I'm going to do it knowing I destroyed you with no reservations. And that's where Shroud conjures his Dark Force energy. And the Dark Force energy doesn't quite work the way that it used to after the events of Blood Hunt. So even at his best, he's still no match for Mark Spectre. And Mark's like, okay, fine. Because at that point, Shroud steps up and says, even with my Dark Force energies more or less kind of all over the place and not really under my control the way they should be, I don't need them. I could still take you out hand to hand, man to man. And initially he does. Like initially he holds his own against Mark Spectre because he is a wildly capable fighter. But Mark Spectre gets the upper hand and Mark Spectre takes him out. And with Badir watching, he says, it's done. This guy is dead. And so following that, he travels to the bar with no name and he tells all the villains who were in there, I'm doing you a solid. I'm doing you a favor, right? It's been a little while and I've been gone. There's been a pretender who's been running around in my name. So all of you who were here, Sandman, Mysterio, Vulture, Spot, any of you villains who were out there, spread the word and let it be known, Moon Knight is back. You stay away from my territory, I'll stay away from your territory. Don't start nothing, won't be nothing. And so at that point, he mounts the false Moon Knight suit of Shroud and leaves. And then you pick up in the Midnight Mission, Shroud's alive and well because Mark Spectre, right? This is one of the best things about Moon Knight. Do not let him trick you into believing that he's some kind of a dum-dum. Is he the sharpest tool in the shed? No. I mean, he's no Reed Richards, you know what I mean? But the guy is incredibly capable. And having spent so much time working for Khonshu, he kind of knows the ways around, right? He knows the little nooks and crannies in order to follow an order, but violate the order at the same time. Because what he does here is where Shroud's just kind of like, okay, what in the world happened? Like, I thought I was a dead man. The response of Moon Knight is, you did die, right? Moon Knight is dead. To save your life, I had to kill you, and I had to stop your heart. And then Badir brought you back, right? He literally just used a defibrillator on you. The Moon Knight concept is dead. It's hanging out in a villain's bar. That version of Moon Knight will never, ever, ever come back. And so you switch over to Mark, talking to Khonshu, and the exchange is phenomenal here, right? Khonshu asks him, he says, do you think yourself clever, my son? And the response of Moon Knight is, I've never been clever, but I've always been obstinate. I will not murder for you, Khonshu, and you cannot make me. And the response of Khonshu is, you owed me a life. And he says, and you got one. The imposter's Moon Knight is dead, never to return. And where Khonshu says, that's not what I wanted, the response of Moon Knight is, I'm not concerned with what you want. A sacrifice to a god is always a symbolic sacrifice. It's not always literal. The imposter's skin hangs pinned in a place of those who hold me and therefore you in terror. I have satisfied your demands. I have paid my debt. And before you threaten Reese or any of my Midnight Mission again, think about your own debt to them, Father. You owe them your freedom. Moon Knight is dead. Long live Moon Knight. With that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. I told you, this story, like Jed MacKay, it's such an enigma. How can Jed MacKay write something as great as Moon Knight and then turn around and write something that's just schmeh as the X-Men? I don't understand it, bro. Editorial decree. They've definitely got limitations on his X-Men run. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this to an end. Let me know what you think down in the comments section. Thank you all for watching. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like and I will catch you all later. Peace.